When considering the topic of sexual abuse during slavery, one might often reflect on numerous instances of white male slave owners violating African women. Though this happened often, the topic of sexual abuse of black slaves by privileged white women is seldom addressed.
Any more, I'll earn you 100 lashes.
Join us as we look at the dark, untold horrors of black male slaves by white women.
Whoop you, sell you. Oh no, maid, he's gonna kill you.
Slavery. Some of the children born to the enslaved women clearly came from loving partnerships, while others were certainly the result of sexual abuse. Slavery has existed for a long time. In recent years, it has become clear that the focus was not solely on race. Upon closer examination of black culture, one can observe that racism prompted white Europeans to perceive themselves as a superior race. Nearly 2 centuries ago, the struggle for independence among black individuals resulted in their designation as free men. For centuries, black individuals endured the harsh realities of slavery, and even after its end, the shadows of discrimination and bigotry from white individuals continued to loom over their culture. With the onset of slavery in 1619, or perhaps even before, black individuals encountered profound struggles. In Africa, they endured the harsh reality of slavery, only to be transported to the Americas thereafter. Numerous locations with predominantly black communities found themselves under the threat of white supremacy. The enslavement of black individuals transformed into a commercial enterprise. Though history has been documented, and we recognize the struggles of black individuals throughout history, countless tales still linger in silence. One of these tales delves into the struggles endured by African slaves, not at the hands of their white male masters, but rather from their wives. Slaves brought to the USA. In the year 1619, British colonies, inhabited by individuals of European descent, took the fateful step of enslaving 20 Africans. Enslaved black individuals were brought to the United States. This was not the inception of slavery or racism against blacks, yet it did signify the commencement of the slave trade. They identified a chance and swiftly commenced the enslavement and exportation of more black individuals from Africa. In the United States, the history of slavery began in August 1619. A greater number of enslaved individuals were brought to the United States, and these black individuals were ultimately exchanged with other nations. White men acquired these slaves, employing them as servants to carry out various tasks, including farm labor and household cleaning. Another common story surrounds these slaves. During the time of enslavement, black women often found themselves subjected to the cruelty and exploitation of their white owners. Numerous experts have commented on this matter, and there exist books authored by black slaves who ultimately gained their freedom. It started with these white individuals asserting their dominance over black women, and this extended beyond just adults. As black women brought new life into the world, they faced the harsh realities of the brutal treatment inflicted by white masters upon their families and themselves. This transformed into their education. Those who enslaved these individuals were not the sole perpetrators of such treatment. Their boys were equally at fault. As black children matured, they began to experience a sense of inferiority. As these children entered their teenage years, the white men and their sons had made some minor adjustments to their perceptions of them. They moved forward to offer these women gifts, aiming to persuade them to take on the role of their personal maids. This title often involved intimate actions, leading many of these girls to be reluctant to remain unscathed. The black teenagers who turned down the rewards presented by their white masters found themselves compelled to submit to these men's sexual desires. In various circumstances, these individuals formed close bonds with these black women, yet this often occurred as white men persuaded teenage girls that they were truly in love. White women. Another aspect unfolds in this narrative. As the men engaged in their heinous acts against the black female slaves, the white women quietly pursued their own activities in the background. It is important to observe that within these white houses, the man held the position of authority. The woman was seen as having diminished respect and was often tasked with household duties like cleaning, washing clothes, and cooking. Even within the white community, women did not possess the same rights as men. Men often regarded their brides as possessions. The women were required to follow the commands given by their husbands. The ownership of slaves emerged as a way for these women to establish their dominance. Black male slaves. The social standing of a woman increased in accordance with the number of slaves she possessed. This is also where the suffering of black male slaves began. Yet, when exploring the realms of black culture and history, one finds it is not a frequently discussed subject. White men were perpetually engaged. They were engaged in the operation of businesses and farms. Simultaneously, African slave women were subjected to sexual abuse. They frequently found themselves lacking the time to connect with their spouses, anticipating everything would be orderly and tidy upon their return home. In the 1680s, the landscape of Virginia plantations transformed as African slave labor emerged as the dominant system. Rather than enjoying the company of their spouses, the white owners opted to delegate the care of their slaves to them. The situation worsened as the ownership of slaves emerged as a representation of female power. Young white children received slaves as gifts for their birthdays. From a young age, they were taught about slavery and instilled with the belief in their own superiority, leading them to accept the mistreatment of black individuals as normal. By the age of 18, a white female's name frequently carried the weight of numerous slaves. This was the situation with the elite. They learned that the greater the number of slaves they owned, the more it showcased their power and influence within the community. It transformed into an emblem of wealth. These women did not merely possess these black male slaves. They were deeply invested in their reputation. They truly began to mistreat them. Their actions transcended mere physical brutality. They resorted to rape as a means of punishing their slaves. In addition to serving as a means of punishment, these women engaged in the sexual abuse of black men to establish their authority and control over them. Given the scarcity of details and discussions surrounding white women owning black male slaves, one might assume that such occurrences were not common. Yet, this is not the case. It stands as another illustration of the efforts made by white supremacists in America to obliterate history. Experts have delved into this matter before and uncovered some remarkable findings. It is revealed that nearly 40% of white slave owners in America were women. This illustrates the prevalence of slave ownership among women of white privilege. It is intriguing to explore the reasons behind the lesser reporting of the abuse faced by black women at the hands of white slave masters. 40% of slave owners were white women. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers serves as a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Throughout the years, she has delved deeply into the subject of black male slave ownership by white women during the era of slavery in the United States. It was she who uncovered the fact that 40% of slave owners were white women. Interestingly, her conclusions stemmed from research she carried out using census data from the years 1850 and 1860. This took place just prior to the end of slavery. This suggests that the statistics might have been considerably more dire had dependable data been accessible sooner. It is essential to acknowledge that slavery persisted for centuries. By 1860, black individuals were actively pursuing their independence, a goal they realized just a few years following Stephanie's census. At the pinnacle of authority, the federal government recorded the ownership of enslaved individuals by white women. It encompassed much more than merely the percentage of female slave owners. Stephanie delved further to uncover the number of slaves owned by the women, and the numbers seemed to be significantly greater than those of the white masters. George Washington's wife. To exemplify this argument, let us reflect on George Washington. This name is familiar to many. He is likely a figure you encountered during your studies in history class. In the present day, he is celebrated as one of the founding fathers of America. In his time, he held the roles of both politician and military officer. It is well established that Washington served as the inaugural president of the United States. Although he is portrayed as a hero of the United States during his time in power, certain aspects are seldom brought to light. This encompasses the reality that Washington possessed slaves. It comes as no surprise that he owned slaves throughout his life, which lasted from 1732 to 1799. all white males in positions of power possessed black slaves. Yet, it is essential to shift your focus beyond Washington and consider his wife. She belonged to a group of white privileged women who did own slaves. After conducting thorough research, Stephanie uncovered some hidden truths about Martha Washington. This encompasses the detail that she possessed her own black male slaves prior to her marriage to George Washington. According to Stephanie's book, by the time of their marriage, George was estimated to have 18 black slaves. This undoubtedly encompassed both men and women, just as it did for most white men during that period. Martha, in contrast, possessed a significantly greater number of slaves under her ownership. Stephanie's investigation uncovered that Martha was believed to have had around 84 slaves. Elizabeth became the wealthiest lady in Virginia during that period, a status that perhaps played a role in her union with George. It is a well-known fact among many Americans that George Washington had enslaved individuals at his Mount Vernon estate. Yet it remains unknown to many that his wife, Martha, played a crucial role in the substantial rise of the enslaved population in that area. Upon their union in 1759, it is believed that George possessed around 18 individuals. Martha, a prominent figure among Virginia's affluent, possessed 84. Prominent men often pursued the most affluent and esteemed women within their societies. As women depended on slaves for economic stability and to showcase their social standing, white masters took this into account when choosing a wife. In conversations about the substantial involvement of white women in the enslavement of black individuals, there are those who tend to offer justifications. For instance, white males perceived themselves as the possessors of their brides following the ceremony of marriage. Slaves were not all black men. Some might contend that these women utilized their possessions of slaves to achieve freedom during the era of slavery. Nevertheless, it is essential to assess the treatment of the slaves. Their access to amenities, healthcare, and other resources was not on par with that of their white female owners. Men often faced abuse and were compelled to have sexual relations with their white female mistresses. While we're discussing this, it's important to note that not all the slaves owned by white women were black men. There were instances where white women obtained black female slaves. Yet the purpose behind this was distinctly different from the reasons they enslaved black males. The white women often expressed their grievances regarding the challenges of motherhood and the demands of nursing their infants. They started to feel as though they have been captured by their very own infants. In response to this feeling, these white women made the choice to enslave black females. Their slaves took on the duty of caring for and nursing their babies. They sought to escape the feeling of enslavement, leading them to turn to black individuals to evade white supremacy. This only contributed to the further degradation and humiliation of black culture during that period. Lizzie Anna Burwell. Numerous instances have been uncovered by scholars in contemporary times, illustrating the narratives of white women who played active roles in the institution of slavery. Examining these accounts reveals the origins of the violence that began to unfold against black slaves under the ownership of white women. Indeed, history classes have depicted a masculine perspective on slavery, yet it was not solely men who exhibited violence towards their slaves. It is certainly important to highlight Lizzie Anna Burwell. She was a young girl of European descent, raised in a privileged household where the institution of slavery was a familiar reality. In her younger years, Lizzie learned that whites held a position of superiority over other races. She watched her parents interact with black individuals and soon mirrored their behavior towards the enslaved. She started to receive slaves as presents from her father. It is important to note that during that period, white women perceived slaves primarily to enhance their economic standing. At a remarkably young age, Lizzie embarked on the journey of creating her property. Yet her aggressive behavior emerged early in her life. At the tender age of 3, she made a peculiar request for one of her attendants to have an ear amputated. She inquired about a new maid, and her father quickly obliged. It has been previously stated that white women were regarded as the property of their white husbands. Numerous individuals who contest the participation of white women in slavery highlight this point. Upon marrying, a white lady was considered the property of her husband. They were bound to follow his instructions, leaving them with no autonomy. This was accurate, but only to a certain degree. Prenuptial agreements. Slaves emerged as a representation of influence and wealth for women, leading to a transformation in dynamics. In the southern regions of the United States, this was particularly evident. Women started to resist the notion that their husbands would take ownership of their property upon marriage. Women often found themselves in court, fighting valiantly for the right to retain their property. On numerous occasions, the women would emerge victorious. This guaranteed the separation of properties belonging to wives and husbands. White women were permitted to retain their slaves as personal possessions. In essence, women believed they had the right to exert total control and ownership over black bodies. In certain situations, these white ladies would draft prenuptial agreements or gift deeds. They were then presented with the chance to pass on ownership of their belongings, which included the slaves in their possession, to another woman. At times, this involved their daughters or another female relative. This enabled these women to evade the responsibility of self-ownership, a situation often encountered upon marriage. It became increasingly common for white women to retain their slaves both prior to and following marriage. A significant number of white women, especially from the aristocratic class, found their path to prestige through the number of slaves they owned. A growing number of white women owned slaves prior to their marriages. The story of Lizzie Anna Burwell was merely one of many occasions where young girls received slaves as presents. As they matured, an increasing number of slaves were bestowed upon them, typically by their fathers. As these girls approached the age of marriage, they frequently found themselves well-versed in the intricacies of slave trading. With the guidance of their mothers, they embarked on a journey to build an economic empire, utilizing the slaves they had acquired during their youth. These women were merciless. Lizzie, in particular, had the ears of her maids severed. Their entitlement to acquire additional slaves stemmed from the circumstances of their upbringing. Nevertheless, it does not justify the treatment of black men and women. It is clear that masculinity was unrelated to the era of black slavery. It is conceivable that white men engaged in the enslavement and transportation of black individuals from Africa to the United States. Nevertheless, this did not stop white women from participating in the endeavors established by their husbands, fathers, or even children. For these women, black men represented something far beyond mere property. They were seen merely as a collective, lacking individual recognition. Black slaves served as attendants, a form of currency, and at times a means for women to express their frustrations. Rape and sexual abuse. Elite white women perpetrated acts of rape and sexual abuse against black men. They executed their plan in a manner that left these men utterly defenseless, for any attempt to resist would only plunge them deeper into peril. These white women perceived no moral conflict in the punishment or execution of a slave. They possessed an abundance of individuals to exploit for their merciless deeds. The individuals toiled in the fields and undertook various other tasks, all without the privilege of freedom. White men violated black women who were included in the slave inventory. In some instances, they even welcomed children into their lives. Yet it is often said that women remained in the shadows. White women were considered the property of their husbands, which is why they remained on the sidelines for reasons that had nothing to do with slavery. The white elite women might have exhibited even greater brutality towards black men than their white male counterparts. History books often overlook this frequently neglected topic. Ultimately, it is essential to assess the participation of all white individuals, not just those men who considered themselves superior to black individuals. Their wives and daughters participated equally in the era of enslavement, just as they did. The rise of white aristocratic women over black male slaves led to a complex interplay of power, resulting in instances of rape, romantic entanglements, and sexual exploitation. Regrettably, this is a facet of black history that often goes unnoticed in conversations. Nevertheless, it is essential to recall the events when white supremacy compelled black individuals into slavery, making them a part of the daily commerce. Have you ever considered the treatment of African slaves by women of privilege in white society? Why don't you let us know in the comments below? Well, that's it for now. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and let us know in the comments what you think. Check out our other videos and subscribe to be part of the fun. Click on the notification icon so you can see our new videos as soon as they're uploaded. Thanks for watching and see you next time.